Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final webinar from heat to asset class mobilizing private investment in district heating. This is the final event to conclude the defined project, which was a partnership between the Energy Modeling Lab, Lund University, Halmstad University, Steinbeis Center, and Euroheat and Power. So, as you could see by the title of this webinar, the main focus of this project was about define district heating as an asset class. And why is this important? As most of you may know, in the next years, district heating will require a huge amount of investment to refurbish existing infrastructure, to add, to decarbonize its existing infrastructure. So only public funding won't be enough. So we need to bring to the sector also private investment, private funding. And for these, we need to make the sector more attractive for these fundings. So this is what the project delved into the past months to try to define district heating as an asset class and thus make it more interesting. So, I will also conduct later after the presentations the Q&A. So you are also invited to write your questions in the chat box below, but also you are allowed to open up your mic and speak if you want. So not only questions, but if you have comments, if you have any other remarks that you wish interesting, you are also allowed to engage with the speakers. So let's move on very quickly to the agenda so I can present you the speakers and how it's going to work. So first we have the first speaker is Daniel Sneum from the Energy Modeling Lab. He's been coordinating this project and will give an overview about it. Then we move on to Luis from Halmstad University, who will talk about the modeling process that was conducted within the project. Then we move to Tobias Popovic from the Steinbeis Transfer Center for Sustainable Finance and Management. Then Christina Lignerud from Lund University. And finally, we have Shivali Mathur from IEA-DHC. Once again, I thank all of the speakers for participating in this webinar. I thank also the events team at Euroheat and Power for always helping us in having a perfect event. And now I have the pleasure of introducing the first speaker, Daniel. So Daniel leads the Find the Age project, as I mentioned, but he's also a researcher at Lund University and at Energy Modeling Lab. He has more than 10 years of experience within the DH sector, doing analysis, consultancy, and research. Daniel, I give you the floor.
Thanks a lot, Evan. And thanks to Euroheat for hosting this. So as Evan just said, will be presenting sort of the helicopter perspective on the project and what we've been doing for the last 1.5 years or so on this project that IEA DHC has been so kind to sponsor. Just a brief clarification. I saw Shivali. She's indeed an expert in the IADHC, but she comes from a different role. But I'm sure Shivali can expand on that afterwards when she comes in. So the project, let me see if I can control. Yeah, there we go. So we come from as a starting point of 13% district heating in 2020. We've been reaching this level in Europe over approximately 100 years. So that's just in round numbers, 1 percentage point growth per decade. And different studies have shown different potentials for 2050, and I think these are already outdated because there's a new study out from Aalborg University I saw just yesterday with even higher potentials. But the point here is that we may be needing to move from 1 percentage point per decade to 1 or 2 percentage points per year for the next 25 years. And I think just for reference, 25 years ago, Putin was elected president and Britney did, oops, I did it again. And it doesn't feel like an awful long time ago. So we are in a bit of a hurry if we are to achieve these numbers. In terms of funding, which this webinar is about, there is some very substantial investment needs that we need to do towards 2050. I'm always a bit cautious when we reach numbers in the trillions scale, but nonetheless, we are potentially at around 2 trillion euros by 2050 in investments for district heating. I think Tobias will dive more in depth with this or maybe provide some background. And for comparison, we try to do some level setting in terms of what kind of money this is. And this is roughly comparable to the COVID recovery in the EU in the 2020s. So it's really a large amount of money that potentially could be deployed. Among the deliverables in the project, we try to share, find and share numbers in this study that is still work in progress. The report is almost done and will hopefully be published soon. And some of the data in that report helps decision makers and stakeholders understand what kind of metrics are we at and what are the KPIs. So we looked at the literature and we surveyed experts in terms of, for instance, cost of capital in this example. And among the experts we surveyed, we saw an average of 7% for 24 and 25. And this is sort of mixing apples and oranges in terms of this is just the pure cost of capital, not looking at the cost of equity or cost of debt split. So it should be used with some caution. Yeah, we can see here they're roughly within the same ballpark, the literature numbers and what we found from experts. We also looked at the internal rate of return and return requirements and discount rates, and those are a bit more all over the place. If we again look at the experts, we saw them providing and sorting out the extremes, the outliers. We are at an average of around 11%. Again, mixing everything together as a pure return requirement for entering into projects. These numbers I just want to keep you in mind, especially the 11%, because we're going to dive into those later on. Also, Lewis will get into this, but we did different analysis. We did GIS modeling of a very detailed case, expanded that to Europe, and thereby having some kind of guinea pig to test different financial frameworks, different hurdle rates, different subsidies to see what happens. We also did modeling, energy systems modeling, the times model, which these are the results from where we see on the vertical axis, we see different hurdle rates. So that you can imagine, you can say that that's sort of the threshold at which you require your returns for a given technology. In this case, it's the generation assets, so it's the heat pumps, the CHPs, the boilers that must generate this level of return. Otherwise, the model will not invest in them. And as we can see here under the greenfield label, this is the district heating market shares in the given city that we tested the frameworks on. So going from 2% hurdle rate, that's a very low hurdle rate, where we see 31% district heating market share. And then as we progress, as we become more and more restrictive in terms of the returns we want to make on the generation assets, the district heating share gets lower and lower. And it's not different from any other aspects of life. If something becomes more expensive, you buy less of it. So if it's more expensive to buy a car, probably buy a smaller car. This is also the case here where we see when we go from the 2 to 4% to, for instance, 12%, we roughly cut district heating market share in half. So it really makes a difference. So that the conclusion is that high return requirement or cost of capital means lower district heating share. The implication in this case is here we've also added the dimension of subsidies. And we see here, if we think back to the average 11% required returns, and I should say there's a large variation, so we also have single-digit required returns in some cases. But if we, in our modeling, looks at what kind of internal rates of return do our model generate, under these conditions, there is no unsubsidized scenario where an investor requiring 11% returns would go in and finance everything. So in other words, and this is just for you who didn't have your coffee yet, the very blunt conclusion is that the market will not solve the widespread deployment of district heating, period. Then we can do different exercises to invite the market in, but leaving it on pure market terms is simply not the solution if we want widespread deployment of district heating. Even subsidized, we see lower levels of district heating. So this translates, again, I won't dive into this too deep because Lewis is going to get back to this, but we try to test these different scenarios out and see the geographical impact of the deployment of networks depending on the different hurdle rates that we have explored in this study. We also see a distinction. One of the key points of the study was to look at the asset class definition. So we fundamentally see district heating not as one single asset class, but as two, at least two, as a subset of for instance, the infrastructure asset class, which is sort of a general accepted type of asset class. And the greenfield ones tends to be associated with higher risk because they haven't yet established themselves. They don't have a customer base. They don't have a proven managerial record. They don't know what happens when they go in the ground. All these things adds to the risk and may be reflected in some more restrictive returns requirements by the people deploying it. On the other hand, if you go to the brownfield, so that is all the existing and mature systems where they have sorted out all the initial troubles that new projects have, not just district heating, but any other kind of project, then we see lower risks associated with that. And as you go through the life cycles, you have maybe some de-risking that can shift the greenfield to something more akin to the brownfield projects. Some conclusions. Again, the market forces alone cannot drive widespread deployment. And why is that? It's because there is a fundamental mismatch between double-digit required returns and single-digit returns from projects. This is probably very similar to other fields of life where projects that would benefit society may not always be attractive to private investors upfront. Historically, we have seen limited deployment on pure market terms, and whereas wider deployment has happened with some public influence of some sort, then you can shift, taking out the public influence when projects are mature. But the initial stages, the very large deployment going from 13% market share to 25 or 50 is unlikely, in my view, to happen on pure market terms. We can do different things to address this, to attract private investors with some public intervention. And overall, you can look at the risk-return relationship. So either you can de-risk by having mandatory connections, guarantees, and so on and so forth, or you can increase the returns, making it more attractive to investors to go in, for instance, through subsidies, but there are many different ways. Last part here is that greenfield and brownfield are two different asset types. But in the Danish case, there is not a big amount of distinction between them according to our data. And that is because the way that the Danes are financing their projects is happening through sort of a uniform funding approach, and then letting the risk analysis be up to the local municipalities and the consultants. And we've seen a pretty good track record on that in terms of risky projects and failing projects. There are also two directions we can take. Large institutionals like pension funds and insurance funds, they would really like some big pipelines, big lumps of money that they can put towards standardized projects. But we also see these very different customized district heating systems requiring customized financing. And they are perhaps sometimes more difficult to put in this standard template that the big institutions would like. So there are two truths that are true at the same time, I would argue. And then finally, we see the consumer ownership. So those that are maybe not driven to the same extent by profits. When we looked at the 11% required returns, and seeing the difference down to the actual cost of capital, that means that you can roughly shave off 4 percentage points in returns requirements for the project, broadly speaking, which is sort of the difference from a commercial developed project to a non-profit project. And this can translate into wider deployment of district heating, as I mentioned before. So with that, I just want to say thanks. And we have some podcasts coming up with, among others, good people from this around this table. So if you want more details, we have podcasts coming up. We have the report coming out soon. Thanks, and I'm happy to take questions when everybody's done speaking here.
Okay, thank you so much, Daniel, for your presentation. Yes, I reinforce Daniel's remarks about the podcast that is coming up. We also have some interviews made with Daniel and Gabriele from Irradiant Empower at the Irradiant Empower YouTube channel. I also invite you to go there and watch it. So we explain a little bit more of the work being done within the project. And of course, stay tuned because the final report is also coming. Okay, so let's move on to the next speaker. I'll soon give the floor to Luis, who will explain about the modeling process that was done within Find. So Luis is an engineer specialized in district heating and cooling, and for the last 5 years he was doing a PhD at Halmstad University in Sweden. And starting from the next month, he will also start working at Hofor, which is Copenhagen's district heating utility. So, Luis, it's you now.
Thank you very much, Evan. Oh, no. Yeah, thank you very much. I will be talking about the geographic information system modeling that we have been doing, as well as the network cost calculation. And this work can be classified into points. The first of which was determination of network costs in a case study. And the second part consisted of the extrapolation of the results from the case study to the European context. So regarding the first point, which was the in-depth study of a case, we first had to choose a city of our interest. In this case, we chose the city of Bilbao because we had a lot of information of the city stemming from the Carb City Pipes 2050 project. Later, once we chose the city, we divided the city into 30 different clusters, and for each of these clusters, we determined the local district heating network. Then we calculated the costs of these 30 different district heating networks, and we estimated what would be the cost for different degrees of expansion. This is if we supply, for example, 10% of the buildings in this cluster, 50% of the buildings, 60%, etc. Later, we group these 30 clusters into 6 zones, which would fit into the times energy system model, because in times we could not simulate 30 clusters. It was too much for the model to run. And we also aggregated the network costs into these 6 times zones. Yep. Yeah. In this first image, you can see the 30 different clusters, and you can see that they have some strange shape, and this is mostly because of the topography of the city. The city is characterized by high elevation difference between areas, so in some cases the clusters follow the topography of the terrain, so they follow more or less the contour lines. They have the same elevation, so they have a very long shape along the mountains. And we also imposed a restriction into these clusters, which was that no clusters should be in both sides of the river because it's typically quite expensive to have this heating network cross a river. So we wanted to minimize this. Once we had selected the clusters, as I say, we calculated the cost of the building district heating networks. We started from each of the clusters and building the district heating network outwards. For each building we added to the network. We calculated what would be the required length, the required diameters, and hence the required costs. We follow an algorithm that was previously devised by Toll and Svensson in 2012 and has been used by other research before. Here you have an example of cluster number 11. In this case, you can see that the network supplies all the buildings, and the center of the cluster is where the district heating pipe network starts and then expands progressively to supply all the buildings in the cluster. Here you would see one of the results of this exercise, and you can see for different amounts of heat supply within one of the clusters, how would be the required investment for this heating network. And in this case, you can see that it's typically cheaper to supply the first gigawatt hours within the cluster, and it becomes steadily more expensive to supply the last megawatt hours or gigawatt hours within the cluster because farther away areas typically are more expensive. You need more pipe to supply basically the same gigawatt hours. So once we calculated the network cost for all these clusters, we grouped them and we calculated the network costs for these 6 times regions, and also the transmission costs between the regions and also within the regions between the different clusters that each region is composed of. We also calculated what were the required the current heat demands and also heat sources. The city is mostly supplied by natural gas, heating oil, and there's some heat pumps and electric heating as well. And also, this information was gathered by type of building. This is whether it was residential or commercial, and also whether it was multifamily or detached. All this information was fed into the times energy model. Here you can see an image, a map of the 6 regions that in which we divided the city. And here you can see what was the network costs for times region 2. And you can see that in red, the regional cost curve with, in this case, different clusters within the region, and also with, in this case, is the cost of building transmission network within the region. Thus, this transmission network communicates one cluster with another. This information was not possible to supply into time, so what we did was a linearized approximation that could be fed into the times energy model, which you can see here in blue. In this case, it's a linear approximation with 3 different steps. Once times energy model receive all this information regarding network costs, our colleagues at Energy Modeling Lab could simulate the supply of the city under different scenarios. And for each of these scenarios, they provided us with the amount of heat that could be covered by district heating. So we could estimate the share of district heating, and estimate what would be the threshold above which district heating would not be feasible. In other words, we saw that, for example, if we supply 30% of the heat demand with district heating, we could build district heating networks until we reach a cost of 300 euros per megawatt hour. And this helped us to do the extrapolation. The extrapolation itself was done in 2 steps. First, we calculated the network costs for the entire Europe with a simplified methodology. And second, applying these thresholds I just mentioned, we determined what would be the amount of heat that could be supplied under the different scenarios. In this image to the right, you can see 2 different scenarios. In blue, the scenario with the 12% discount rate, and in red, the scenario with the 4% discount rate. So you can clearly see that when we have a higher discount rate, we just supply the densest areas of the cities. In this case, we have two examples of Toulouse and Birmingham. And when we reduce the discount rate, we can expand the district heating network to less dense areas which are more expensive. So you can see that in red, the area that can be supplied by district heating is substantially larger than the area that can be supplied when we have a higher discount rate. As conclusion, we combine the application of a time synergy model with geographic analysis for determination of the district heating potential under different financial conditions. And second, we try to extrapolate the results of the case study to the European scale. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Luis, for your presentation. I saw that some people arrived recently, so in the middle of your presentations. I welcome everyone, and I remind that you're allowed to write your questions in the Q&A box for later. When all the presentations are over, we're going to have a Q&A session. You're also going to be allowed to open your mic and your camera to speak and interact directly with the speakers. So not only questions, but also remarks, comments, anything that you might want to add. So you are free to do that. The Q&A will be done after all the presentations are done, so by the end of the webinar. So stick with us until the end. So now I'll present the next speaker, which you can already see by the presentation, is Professor Dr. Tobias Popovic, and he holds a professorship in Corporate and Sustainable Finance, Financial Markets and Service, and CSR in the Economics Department at HFT Stuttgart. He has been Ethics Officer since 2010 and was also Sustainability Officer at HFT, from 2010 to 2017. Since 2014, he has been co-director of the Center for Sustainable Business and Management, and his main areas of research are sustainable finance, sustainable entrepreneurship, and innovation, and the ethical implications of AI, which he and his team work in various third-party funded projects for federal and state ministries, the EU, foundations, and in multilateral organizations like the IEA. Professor, I give you the floor now.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind invitation and also introduction, Evan. And I will just jump directly into the topic. And thank you, Daniel, also for preparing the ground. I will dig a bit deeper in some of the issues you raised. And unfortunately, I have to start with bad news for the rollout of district heating. Namely, you mentioned it already. Sorry, that was too fast. You mentioned it already. So we need massive financing in order to make the rollout successful. What you see here is a table where we have a split between the state of Baden-Württemberg, which is in the southwest of Germany, and which is the first state where regional or local heat planning is mandatory. In the middle you have Germany, and at the bottom you have the EU. And until 2030, we need approximately 300 billion, or until 2045, 2050, approximately 2,000 billion, 2 trillion. Of course, we have great variations here that is due to different assumptions that underlie the studies we have analyzed. But to conclude, it's massive investments that are needed. So that's the first bad news. The second bad news is that public budgets are empty or less than empty. So here we have an overview of Eurostat displaying how the debt rates are in Q1 of this year. Just to remind, actually, for every Euro member country, the debt ratio must actually be below 60%. But for most of the countries, it's way above 60%, so they are over-indebted. And the debt levels, that's what you see on the right-hand side, are still rising because the deficits are too high as well. So that's the second part of the bad news. But later on, I will try to provide you with some good news, of course. So one approach to solve the problem is, and Dan, you mentioned it, to think of district heating as an asset class, and then to try to attract institutional investors, but also retail investors via financial markets. And that's a process Christina and I and other colleagues designed in another project for the European Union. So we started, of course, with the technology, with the infrastructure, and then infrastructure needs to be transformed into a business model, for example, based on a local heat plan. Then it needs to be translated into the language of investors, so making it an investment case, an investment story along the investment criteria of investors. And that hopefully will help to attract investors. And at the last step, you agree, or the operators, for example, of the infrastructure project, they agree with investors on the modalities of financing and especially the specific instruments. So one issue is, and Danny raised also already the issue, the differentiation between greenfield and brownfield. Brownfield is actually, from an investor's point of view, rather low risk. So because it's here, if we look at the infrastructure life cycle, it's later stage. So it's something which already exists, a grid, a network that only needs to be refurbished. So, for example, substituting fossil fuel by waste heat or other renewable resources. That applies for Scandinavia, for example, but unfortunately not for most parts of the European Union, where we have the opposite, namely greenfield, and that starts in the first phase of the life cycle, and that's the high risk area. And we come to that later a bit more in detail, but risk is not really what, and complexity, of course, what investors like. So we need to think, first of all, about transparency about the risks, so make it transparent. And secondly, that's what you see at the bottom of the page, about risk transfer and risk mitigation. For example, state guarantees are a useful approach here, especially in times of negative budgets and high levels of debt. And what we also try to do is to map different groups of investors to the different life cycle phases or stages, and secondly also to map the financing instruments. And so, like Daniel said, looking at the high required rate of returns, the financial markets won't solve the problem alone, and just the figures I presented would lead to the conclusion that public money is not available either. So maybe, and that's what you see in orange here, combining both areas might be a useful approach, and that's called blended finance. So to bring public money and private money together, and that's especially from our point of view useful for greenfield and early stage projects. You just saw the different risks along the life cycle stages and the instruments, and in the FIND project, Daniel, for example, conducted lots of interviews. And what was quite interesting was that we had some empirical findings on risks, so resulting from the expert interviews, and basically most of the things we just flip back, for example, what we identified for the first two stages, based on literature analysis in the reward heat project, for example, was more or less proven by what Daniel found out with different stakeholders. For example, in general, we have fuel prices and CO2 pricing, for example, the ETS system as critical variables, and also risks, of course, and especially referring to greenfield. So especially complexity is a huge problem, and lack of transparency that comes from or applies to the technological area, but also political, administrative, planning risks, etc. Heat tariffs is a threat to for the business model, and we also have consumer protection in that area, which is kind of a barrier, leading rather to a low required rate of returns, high investment volume, high investment costs, CapEx, max and OpEx, especially upfront is a problem. And yeah, I don't want to spend too much time, but to make a long story short, so these risks have been proven by the expert interviews. Of course, from a scientific point of view, more surveys would be needed, and more respondents would need to be interviewed, for example, to get a more proven picture. But I think that is also a very useful indication that we have here. Why is that important? Because in the investors' decision-making process, basically 4 dimensions are really important. It's above all, of course, the return they might earn, and that's strongly related with the risk they are taking. And that's what we see here on the left-hand side in the conceptual illustration. So the higher the risk is, so if we go from left to right, the higher the risk is, the higher would be the required rate of return investors want to have. In the middle, we have rather good news because of the last few years, we had falling interest rates, but that was only as a consequence of falling inflation rates due to lower central bank rates, which of course also feed into the required rate of return. But nevertheless, for example, and that's the table on the right-hand side, depending on the type of investment, Danny mentioned it, the differences between equity and debt and so on, and the risk that they contain, that we have variations with the required rate of returns, and especially equity, which is needed in the first stages, you easily end up with double-digit required rate of returns of investors. So that's risk and return as investment decision criteria, but also we have liquidity as a 4th criterion or dimension, and you see it at the bottom here. That's what we introduced with our magic square approach. And the 4th dimension is sustainability, meaning ESG, and that has been also pushed by regulatory activities like the EU Action Plan that investors need to take into account also, for example, in the environmental subdimension, carbon footprint. So that's just summing up our magic square. So we have these 4 dimensions, and we also derived different key performance indicators, helping to provide transparency to investors when they think about going into district heating as an asset class of specific projects. So now we turn our view again to blended finance. So again, it's combining public money with private money. And the idea is, in times of low public budget, that the little money which is still available should rather be provided in form of guarantees. And that's what you see at the bottom left. So the guarantees are used for de-risking. And de-risking means that hopefully private capital or commercial capital, as is mentioned here, could be mobilized on financial markets. Why? Because that's what you see at the right-hand side. The risk-return relationship improves. And this makes it more attractive for investors to go in, and that hopefully will lead to mobilize private money on financial markets and to channel it in. Actually, EU regulation was thought of incentivizing the entire process, but you see it here, we called it a regulatory jungle because there are too many different initiatives from the EU side that actually aim at the same direction, namely, for example, fighting climate change, but they are not really coordinated. And that creates complexity for the operators on the one hand side who need the money, but on the other hand side, also for investors. You might have heard of the EU Omnibus, which is driving through or has been driving over the last few months through the EU Parliament. And that was actually thought of of providing more transparency and more coordination in this regulatory jungle. But unfortunately, the opposite happened. So why is that? Because over all the negotiations and discussions going on for the last 9 months or so, it created much higher uncertainty to investors and operators. And one thing which you need for providing transparency is data. Data about carbon footprints, about energy consumption, and especially also standardized data. And the omnibus was not really helpful in achieving that, because especially the number of data points to be reported is thought of to be reduced massively, and that really doesn't help in order to make investor decision making easier. So last week we had in the European Parliament the decision, and unfortunately the outcome from my point of view was not in a way that would be helpful for making it easier channeling money into district heating. The last few minutes, I will just briefly hint at Germany, which is talked about as a sleeping giant, and maybe it's currently switching from a sleep mode to a panic mode. Why? Because many municipalities started really late with heat planning and haven't thought of how to finance that. And now that they, especially in the southwest of Germany, are about to implement the heat plans, they discover that they do not have the money. And they are confronted with these massive investment volumes I just mentioned, and especially for the public utilities, the municipal utilities called Stadtwerke, and they desperately need more equity, but that's a problem if the municipality as the owner is over-indebted. So we have rather high bottlenecks, and what we just discussed with the benefit finance approach, following the question how to mobilize money, might be something hopefully helping in this process. So that's what we just recently in August also tried to condense a bit in a position paper, and there we offered different possible solutions. For example, a financing platform which is bundling money from financial markets and channeling it into the different projects, or there are also different concepts currently discussed under the label energy transition funds. But we need approaches for recapitalizing the Stadtwerke as well, and also to channel in retail investors. And in many respects, I would say Denmark is a really good role model where other countries like Germany can learn from, be it in the form of financing platform, Kommunekredit is it called in Denmark, but also to channel retail investors' money in there, like in the form of heat cooperatives. Yeah, since time is running out, I would just maybe in my conclusion outlook stress one or two aspects. So especially ambitious CO2 pricing is really important all over the European Union, because that really creates incentives for everybody, for every stakeholder involved to shift, to move to renewables, and by that drive the carbon footprint down. We need more holistic approaches, interdisciplinary approaches from a technological and financial markets point of view, but also taking the stakeholders, the clients for serious, involving them, and yeah, establish, like just mentioned on the last slide, some kind of national regional financing agencies or platforms following the example of Denmark. And by that, hopefully we will be successful in attracting investors to district heating. So that was all from my side. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm looking forward to the discussion later on.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Tobias, for your presentation. I now move on to the fourth speaker of this webinar, which is Christina Lignerud. So she has worked with risk management, business development and change management at Boras Energy and obtained a PhD in industrial and financial economics in 2010. She also spent some time as a senior financial analyst at Baxter Healthcare in Zurich, and currently she works with business model innovation for sustainability, mainly in the field of district energy. She's the co-founder of the collaboration platform for decarbonized district energy solutions, 1021. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me in this webinar. It's hard to provide more insights than has already been given, but I will do what I have done throughout the project, which is to give real life discussions, some concrete life, and bringing them into the research project. And I will summarize different ongoing discussions on the asset class of district energy that I come across in different contexts, and then focus on some selected risk exposures and loop back to the approach from the project here to de-risk the asset class. So next slide, please. So when you talk to people about district heating, there are different perspectives on it. For some people, it's news because it's a new market or it's a new kind of investor. But really, it's not new, and the risks associated with new technologies are not present because this has been around for many decades. So it's all about presenting the asset class to the investor. And then you often come across that this asset class, it's not for everyone to invest in because of the very long lives of the assets. And that is true. It's maybe most convenient for investors with long time horizons, like pension funds or such. But these things can also be overcome. There is a great example where you had an industry with a short time horizon with a lot of waste heat. And then there was a district energy company interested in the waste heat. And they had different needs for payback. And this was arranged so that the district heating company could wait for their payback and the industry could get their money within 3 years, which is referred to as patience capitals. So all these kind of assumptions about the asset class, they can be worked on, and maybe it can be for more investors than only the ones with long time horizons. Then there are many discussions. Oh, maybe you can go back to where we were. Thank you. Then there are many discussions on how to unlock the sector, and Tobias just talked about, for example, blended finance, combining the private and public funds to de-risk. And this is becoming more and more relevant because there is not enough public money around. So you need these new constellations. But just as we need technical innovation, we then need financial innovation. We need new stakeholders from the finance community to start interacting in new ways. So there will be probably a big development in the blended finance applications for district energy as we go towards the future. And then another much discussed topic when you talk about this asset is that it should be a desirable asset because it has all the features that we need in the future with low climate impact, circularity, renewables coming into play. So we need some kind of structure, a financial structure also at EU and national levels. And I am part of the EU's investors dialogue on energy. And there, for example, there are first thoughts on making some kind of joint fund for district energy for Europe. So these are some ongoing discussions. So you can see from this that there are different degrees of knowledge about the asset class, and there are different approaches to unlock it for a wider community. Now, please change slides. Yes. And then let's go and see what some risk exposures are that are important to manage. So when we look outside of the companies or the projects, there are some external risks. For example, we see technology shifts in the sector where we have had a history of combustion-based systems, where this is now changing towards systems with renewables, storages, and waste heat. And that is, of course, important to remember when you are an investor. What kind of investment are we doing? Is it the conventional one? Is it the new one? Are we impact investors? Do we want combustion? So all these things are important to understand when you make your investment. And the main conclusion there is that all district energy investments are not identical. Then we also see other external risks coming up. One is the EU taxonomy, for example. It's a great structure to ensure sustainable investments, but it's also pushing away from combustion. So that's another indication that in the future, the setup of district energy investment cases will look different. In different projects where I have been, there has been approaches and ambitions to bundle district energy projects across country boundaries, and that has proven difficult because we have very heterogeneous regulation across markets in Europe. So there is also a need to understand that what district energy is in Denmark or Sweden or Germany, it's completely different in terms of a market perspective. So this is also something to remember, that you cannot put all investment contexts at the same level and understand them at the same kind of approach. We also see that the heat supply prices for heat supply, it's a big risk. And in the model mentioned by Luis, you can stress test these things, right? But you have to know what the main drivers of risk are. Fuel prices, electricity prices, demand changes, that kind of thing. And then there is also an external pressure in Europe that we have to decarbonize, we have to repower EU, those kind of solutions. And that means that there is big competition from quicker fixes like heat pumps. And all these things have to be accounted for when you look at the asset. Next, please. Next. And then there are also internal risks to be aware of, because when you have big technology transitions, you will need new skills also in the organizations. You will have to start working with prosumers, customers that both have waste heat and provide waste heat to the systems, create win-win arrangements. You have to have new capabilities in-house, that kind of thing. And there is a risk that you are then still doing what you've always done in terms of business modeling, and you get outdated business models that are no longer efficient. And on top of that, there is also a risk that there are internal efficiencies here and there in existing systems. And at the same time, all the companies who are getting a more diverse heat supply portfolio, they need to become smarter. So we have different levels of digitalization ongoing in the sector, where some companies are very advanced, maybe even over digitalized, and some are not yet there. So we also have to be aware that external pressures and shifts also lead to internal pressures and shifts. And when you make an investment, it's important to have the transparency of both internal and external risk exposures. Next, please. And then we come back to the approach applied in this project. Next, please. And here we saw Luis explaining a lot of detail how you can investigate a greenfield possible district energy area, the case of Bilbao, and getting a good level of control on the external risk pressures. You can get transparency of the risk factors, of dependencies, on what to do over different time horizons, that kind of thing. So it creates transparency and provides a better starting point for an investor interested in the investment case. That said, this is only part of the de-risking that is needed, because also the organizational structure, maturity, and development pace has to be accounted for. Next, please. Yes, and then next. So some concluding remarks from my side is that in order for large-scale district heating asset expansion, we need to de-risk it in different ways, looking at the external risks, but also internal, and maybe also offsetting some of the uncertainties with standards that could go across heat markets. Because then it will be possible to categorize district energy as a sustainable asset. And we have also seen that money might be the issue right now, at least until we get a certain level of investments going. So most likely some kind of subsidies are needed initially, and then money should start flowing into the sector. Thank you. That was my outlook.
Thank you so much, Christina, for your presentation. Before we move on to the fifth and final presentation, I just want to remind that for the Q&A, as I wrote in the chat already, don't forget to put your association or company and your role in it, so I can also introduce you and your question. And for those who wish to actually speak, open up the mic. Also write in the Q&A that you wish to speak, so the team can actually allow you to open it. Otherwise, you cannot open. You cannot speak it. It's a little bit bureaucratic, I know, but it's to avoid many people opening the mic at the same time and having a confusion. Okay, so now we move on to the final presentation, which is from Shivali Manthur, which is an engineer and MBA in finance with over 20 years of experience in energy markets and infrastructure. She has led high-impact initiatives for the United Kingdom government and held senior roles in private sector focused on heat decarbonization. Shivali's expertise spans policy, program delivery, and business development, working closely with government, regulators, and industry to drive innovation in the energy transition. She also champions leadership and mentoring, having founded the public sector district heating divas and women in district cooling in India. In India, networks to promote the next generation of energy professionals. Shivali, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Evan. Can you see me, Evan?
Yes, we can see you.
My view is slightly different. Yeah. Thank you so much, and very kind introduction. As Daniel mentioned earlier, that I've been working in the background with him. He's done most of the work with the team, and he provided the helicopter view of the project. It is quite an interesting topic on heat as an asset class. And as Christina said, I think everybody has covered quite a lot already. So I'll try to give my reflections. My background, as Evan said, is a lot on renewables. Started off with heat pumps and then heat networks, and have been in commercial. So I was a secondment for 2 years at Ampersite, and have been working a lot on the commercial side of these aspects. And I'll try to reflect a little bit on those aspects, and hopefully that's that's informative to the audience. Very high level, I think what we are hearing from everyone and what we've heard since morning is scale, acceleration, investment, and funding. So there is an angle on how do we bring more investment in, combine the public-private sector investment, get to the level of scale, attract it, and then accelerate the market, both on, I would say, heat and cooling as well. So I think heat for this side and cooling for the other side of the world of the continent. And it's the same concept, that this is possibly a great asset class that has been added in the last few years, specifically, at least I would say in UK. Now, reaching carbon neutrality is, I would say, much more than just an environmental issue. It can drive a range of specific and wider economic benefits. And that actually provides the opportunity to drive significant economic growth and impact positively lives of people. And that can happen in an area, it can happen in a wider range. So projects like these can lead to high quality jobs in green industries, improve places to live and work, better health outcomes if you're reducing the carbon, so we're cleaning the air, and helping to address some inequalities in some city region for too long. So by leading a scale and pace, at scale and at pace, areas have an opportunity to lead in reinvigorating regional manufacturing, supply chain, skills development, and then accruing the benefits of net zero. So zoning in into, again, heat as asset class, and Daniel mentioned about it earlier, that it's all about putting it all together and how to make the internal rate of return higher to attract the investment. There are, I would say, this probably aspect has been touched by Dr. Tobias indirectly, that there is a role a public sector or a private sector can play, and that role can be very, very simply put, can be an enabler role. So I've seen networks in the past where the public sector has taken a role to enable the stakeholder engagement, which is absolutely critical in projects like these, because you've got loads of off-takers and few networks. The other role can be of a customer. So you as a big hospital or you as a big university, or can be an anchor load. Then how do you negotiate the terms? How do you bring your load how do you ensure that your stranded assets or your assets which are already in the picture can be offered as a resilience in the system, so make it financially workable for yourself and network. And the third role can be investor. So obviously there is a role of the investor coming in, but there can be models created where you can have customers as investors into the joint venture type scenario. So really, really interesting combinations where then you can increase or have an impact on the financial model. Now, asset class complexity, I know Dr. Tobias had quite nicely explained the different at the different stages, how you can have the risk identification and mitigation at the stage of strategy, construction, operation, and then termination. But each asset class, if I'd really, really simplify it, it has different commercial characteristics and requirements. And to deliver that investment, a range of commercial models are needed. I would say some of them have been tested in some geographies and others in other. There was an example Daniel mentioned about Denmark on greenfield and brownfield, them having a similar approach because of uniform funding approach. That's one commercial model. There are commercial models where obviously, so there are, or in the Q&A on how can you expand on the UK side, there are advanced zoning projects which are currently being worked on with the Department for Energy Security, and there is a string of standardization. There is a string of different commercial models in different procurements. There were 2 procurements coming out in London last year for commercialization work, one in Plymouth this year, and these are at the level of £300 million plus or bigger. So they're big, big procurements. And the few of the main things, if you're looking at asset class complexity, is revenue models, the commercial models, the risk appetite, all these words which have been used previously in the presentation. And I'm trying to give more life to it, that this is happening in different areas. And there's obviously no size, it's not one size fits all. So you can't just have one model that generates expected investor returns in one area, and that's probably the similar in the other. It's quite place-based. And working on Greater Manchester from years before, it's quite interesting how they define the different asset classes between solar, EV, heat networks. And their thinking is that they want to play a role where they have a fair net zero transition and they avoid the cherry picking from private investors. So rather than them just picking up the projects which are commercially viable, they're trying to create a mix, which is quite interesting. So if you look at a city as a totality, a strategic energy partnership, then you have different range of pipeline. And pipeline is also key. I don't know if that word was used before. That's quite attractive to investors when they can see that how they can diversify their risk across the different asset classes. That brings a little bit more certainty to them. Market engagements talked about, so I had a couple of points on that, but won't go into details because it was discussed. Another one, specifically good point, is supply chain and skills. With my own experience of 12 years into heat pumps, I've seen that trajectory, at least in UK, where seeing the growth from a double-digit to 4-digit growth in an organization, a leading manufacturer, it is quite interesting how we had to work in a boiler market, so a completely one sector focused market, to move the boiler engineers think about heat pumps. And that sometimes, I think somebody has mentioned about somebody's asked Q&A on policy. Policy can favor, sometimes policy can incentivize market, but a lot of times, until unless a supply chain is there, the skills are embedded in the market, consumer confidence cannot grow. So it's quite an important point that yes, revenue models, delivery structures, enabler roles of private sectors or public sector, great market engagement. But again, that layer of consumer confidence is quite important. So local supply chain, development of skills, creating that higher understanding of how things work, absolutely key. And just unpacking a little bit, just giving 2 minutes on delivery structure, how important that can be. A clear structure can establish a coordinated approach to deliver. And I think that gives certainty to everybody in the value chain. It's critical to the success of a program to build credibility with stakeholders, enhance the investor confidence, create that clarity and simplicity in the process. It is a big ask. It is significant, but quite an important one. And it helps develop a project pipeline with certainty, and it helps in mobilizing funds and resources. Dr. Tobias also mentioned about the different types of investors in the different stages. So with the different types of investors, obviously comes different drivers, different motivations. You can have impact investors looking at social outcomes. You can have institutional and Daniel's interviewed pension fund investors as well in his project. Really, really different outcomes. And a very, very quick example, I was in an energy as a service call a few months ago with Metris, and they gave examples on how they can make complex energy upgrades possible through an energy as a service approach. They gave an example of how they can fund and own the equipment. They partner with turnkey providers on design, construction, maintenance, and monitoring, and customers are actually just paying based on measured performance. So imagine not owning a washing machine and just paying for washes that you do on a day or a weekly basis. Takes the whole hassle away from a person like me on getting it fixed, if I'm honest. When you've got children and dog at home, you want to be as risk-free on getting things repaired. So I think it's a clever way of how the risks can be, and then that is exactly what Christina said, that risk return appetite, the reward situation. So if you want to take that risk, then obviously you have a lot of control and you have a higher proportion to reward. It's directly proportional. But if you're giving that to a third party, then obviously there is a little bit of compromise we do in a reward situation. So hopefully that has brought a little bit more life to what we have been discussing since morning, and more than happy to take questions as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shivali. Thank you all the speakers for your presentation. Right on time, so now we have some 20 minutes for some Q&A. And I will actually start with my own question, if I can, that is directed to Tobias, Professor Tobias, but of course, all of the speakers are allowed to develop on that if they wish so. I saw you already replied, Professor, to the question from Fulia, which mentioned about the reaction you get when you communicate your conclusions and recommendations to the policymakers. I want to develop a little bit on that. Like you presented, we already have like a huge framework of policies and regulations in place at European level. My question is now, how much of this jungle, like you mentioned, helps with access to funding or to attract private funding, better put, and how much does it hinder, and how would you consider to be a good way of attracting to develop policy and regulations that could actually attract private capital to district heating and cooling?
Yeah, thank you. So it's quite a differentiated question. So there are a couple of angles to start with, and I would like to start with the carbon pricing. So since this is a very market-oriented, powerful tool and applies to everything we consume day by day, so that would really help in making the price is right. So since we are ignoring the external effects of carbon and the damages, and we are not integrating that them into market prices, so that would, in the first glance, or the first step, probably lead to a shift to more fair market prices. And that, of course, will also lead to shifts in energy prices, so especially fossil fuel will become more expensive, and that will incentivize, in the case of district heating, that people move in that direction from the consumer side, and of course, the operators will follow. So the demand will increase. Secondly, we have from EU regulation the EU Action Plan on Financing Sustainable Growth, so-called Action Plan on Sustainable Finance. And the first and foremost example was to rechannel, to redirect capital flows from unsustainable to sustainable assets. So that actually, when it was launched in 2018, was a very, very powerful move in order to open up financial markets for sustainable assets. But now comes the big but, in terms of sustainability reporting. Now the omnibus is basically eroding the databases investors need in order to take the decisions. So they need the data points in order to calculate the KPIs. I try to outline with our magic square. So if we go into the corner on sustainability, they need the data points in order to get the KPIs and to take their decisions. And exactly this is now currently at risk. So actually two powerful tools from regulatory side, carbon pricing on the one hand side, and the action on the other hand side. And since you mentioned the barriers, so one big barrier is that, for example, the EED, the RED, then if you turn to buildings, the EPBD, and the action plan are not really well coordinated, and that provides complexity, and complexity is a barrier in this whole process.
Thank you, Professor. I'll keep the questions on the financial side. Moving to the financial side. I'll ask now Daniel. So in your opinion, Daniel, which financial conditions can help achieve large-scale DH deployment, but not only achieve it fastly?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. I think this is a question that we have also discussed a bit internally, because I believe we came to this study in this sort of from a de-risking mode, you could say. What does it take to bring in more investors into the field? And I still think this is true. We've discussed balancing out the risk-return relationship. So if we sort of bring about the right conditions, the financial community tends to be quite agile in moving into places where they can see nice returns and risk-reward relationships. That said, I think I'm still skeptical towards obtaining the level of speed that we may need to do this. For one thing, district heating, along with a lot of other aspects of actions that are to the benefit of society, but that doesn't generate the rates of return that investors would require. It's not unique. We see it in other sectors, and the concept for this is this financial viability gap. So that's a general problem in different sectors where we need to sort of bridge that gap in some sense. But you could also say, so if that's one way to go about it, and I agree with everything that's been said already. But in some cases, it may also make sense that we simply sort of bypass the financial community, or say you are no longer in the driving seat, but you are on a co-driver supporting the whole process by funding through blended finance, but states taking a much stronger lead in terms of widespread deployment. And when we've seen examples of that I mean, for instance, the Nordics or Denmark is a case. Sweden probably also, where we had strong public intervention in the beginning. That was strong planning, taxation policy, different measures to bring in wider deployment. China is a more recent case where we've seen really high growth rates. I think of Northern China, 8% per year expansion. So that's more than the 1 or 2% per year I mentioned in the beginning. But that requires people to accept and be comfortable with more public control of the process. And Tobias has mentioned the very real problem of the debt levels of states. That is certainly a barrier to doing this. But I just want to emphasize that there are different ways to go about this. And you can invite in and create beneficial conditions for the financial community, but you can also have the more straight state-driven deployment if you are not in too heavy debt in terms of providing the funds yourself.
Thank you, Daniel, for answering. I'll ask now another question actually to Tobias. Um, why do you think, Professor, that de-risking is more important than public funding for the rollout of district heating in Europe?
It directly connects with the last question you asked to Daniel and what he elaborated on. So if public money is simply not available because of the high debt levels, or I mean, we are seeing it currently in France, and that is a situation no country should come in to, namely that from an investor's point of view, so the French government needs to be funded, right? In order to fund, they, of course, issue bonds, and they depend on the financial markets so that investors buy these bonds. Since the reforms do not make much progress in France, and as a consequence, public deficits are increasing, so the trust in the French government is decreasing in financial markets. So that's increasing risk, and increasing risk leads to rating downgrades. And combining these two aspects, that leads to higher required rate of returns. And the consequence is that the French government now needs to pay more or higher interest rates, and that makes the public deficits even worse and leads to even higher debt. So there's a vicious circle, and that applies basically to every country. And so this is something we definitely need to avoid, because then things get worse before they get better. So public money is not really available, but what is available, and of course that depends on the different member countries on the respective legislations. But what in many countries that's possible, that instead of provide liquidity, meaning money, they can provide guarantees. And that wouldn't have a negative effect on the public budgets. And so I would consider that as a very, very strong lever to avoid higher deficits, to avoid higher debts, and nevertheless accelerate infrastructure investments. And for example, district heating is just one sector of infrastructure which needs investments, and that can also be applied to other sectors, especially the ones which would bring us forward in the sustainability transformation in many respects. So that's where I would see the big advantages in de-risking efforts provided by guarantees.
Thank you, Professor. I see Christina has raised her hand. Do you want to complement it?
Yes, just an addition. I think that the de-risking is very important, because we still see this conventional approach among sustainable investors that risk return is always in focus. And I think that is actually reflecting that the EU has gone ahead with a lot of programs and packages to foster sustainable investments, but there was not really any restructuring of how to provide the funding. So we still have a conventional approach of funding projects, and they are very risk return related, even though we want to encourage sustainable investments. So me and Tobias, we have been talking about that there is a need for also structural change in order to foster sustainable investments.
Great. Thank you, Christina and Tobias, for answering this question. Uh, I actually see one Q&A. It's actually a comment, so there's no need to answer it. Discuss the opportunities outside the UK, include Germany and European England. Yes, this can be done later. I don't see any other questions from the public, so I will give one last time the floor to all of the speakers if they wish to add any final remarks. Any of the speakers would like to complement something from your presentations or the overall study conducted during the project?
Evan, just one, if I have to just
Yes.
bring one word and to get a takeaway, I think it's collaboration. You'll be able to mobilize the private investment in district heating by collaborating with right stakeholders and bringing clarity in the models and the structures.
Thank you, Shivali, for your comments. We are reaching the final stages of this webinar. I once again thank all of the speakers, Daniel, Luis, Tobias, Christina, and Shivali, for being present here today, for sharing a little bit of their knowledge with all of us. It was a great moment to talk about finance in district heating and cooling. And I remind everyone that this webinar is recorded, so very soon it will be available at the Euroheat Power YouTube channel. So if you want to rewatch it, like go back and remember some of the main points, it will be there soon. Also, all of the presentations will be shared with those who registered, so you will receive in your email all of the presentations very soon by the events team. I remind that this project have the podcast, which will be released very soon, and we also have two interviews that were conducted earlier this year with Daniel and Gabriele that talked about the work being done within the project. Go there. I share the links here in the chat, but also go always to our YouTube channel to watch them. The final report will be available soon. It will be also on the Euroheat and Power Knowledge Hub, but it also will be distributed in other web pages and websites. You can also download it and read it when it is available. I think it's very substantial content there. So said that, thank you also the events team, Mariette and Taig, for always helping us, to always preparing perfect events. And with this, I conclude this webinar and wish everyone a good morning and a good weekend. Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank
Very
you.
much. Bye bye.